Sometime this week, you probably swallowed a pill. Maybe it was this morning. You didn't inspect it. You didn't test it. You just trusted it. You trusted that somebody, somewhere, checked what was inside. Here's the thing. For the first 130 years of America's existence, nobody checked. Nobody? No FDA. No safety testing. No ingredient labels. No prescriptions. Anyone could put anything in a bottle, call it medicine, and sell it to you, your children, and your dying grandmother. And they did. They put morphine in baby syrup. They put cocaine in toothache drops. They sold heroin as a cough remedy over the counter, marketed for children. So the question isn't just historical curiosity. It's actually kind of chilling. What was really inside American medicine before 1906? Who finally decided to find out? And why did it take 100 dead children and a chemist feeding poison to volunteers in a government basement to change anything at all? Because this isn't just a story about medicine. It's a story about trust, about what happens when an entire nation swallows whatever it's sold, and about how the label on your bottle, the one you never read, was paid for in funerals. Let me take you back to a morning in 1898 in a cramped tenement kitchen on the Lower East Side of New York. A young mother is pacing the floor. Her infant daughter has been screaming for 2 days. Teething. The mother is exhausted, desperate, and out of options. So she does what her neighbor recommended, what the newspaper advertised, what the druggist on the corner sold her for 25 cents. She reaches for a small bottle with a gentle, smiling label. Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup. For children teething. She gives her daughter a spoonful. The screaming stops almost instantly. The baby sleeps. The mother finally sleeps too. What the label did not tell her was that each fluid ounce of that syrup contained 65 milligrams of morphine. Not a trace, not a residue. 65 milligrams of pure opiate, dissolved in sweetened alcohol, spooned directly into infants. Some babies slept through the night. Some babies never woke up. The American Medical Association would eventually give Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup a different name. They called it the baby killer. And here is the part that should stop you cold. None of this was illegal. None of it was even secret. It was simply the market doing what unregulated markets do. To understand how America got here, you have to understand the world after the Civil War. The war sent hundreds of thousands of men home wounded, sick, and addicted to the morphine that battlefield surgeons had handed out like water. It also left the country with almost no real doctors. Medical schools were unregulated. Licensing barely existed. In vast stretches of rural America, the nearest physician was a day's ride away, and he might know less than the barber. Into that vacuum rode the patent medicine men. They sold tonics, bitters, elixirs, and cure-alls with names that promised everything. Kickapoo Indian Sagwa, Swamp Root, Hostetter's celebrated stomach bitters, Lydia Pinkham's vegetable compound. They cured, according to their own advertising, consumption, cancer, catarrh, weak blood, female complaints, lost manhood, and death itself. What was actually in the bottles was simpler. Alcohol. Enormous amounts of alcohol. Hostetter's bitters ran about 44% alcohol. That's 88 proof. Stronger than whiskey. Peruno, one of the best-selling medicines in America, was roughly 28% alcohol and almost nothing else. In dry counties where the saloons were banned, respectable church-going women took their nightly medicine by the tablespoon and never asked why it warmed the throat. And when alcohol wasn't the active ingredient, the alternatives were worse. Laudanum, which is opium dissolved in alcohol, sat on general store shelves next to the flour. Cocaine toothache drops sold for 15 cents, with a cheerful illustration of 2 children playing on the box. And in 1898, the Bayer Company, the same Bayer that makes your aspirin, introduced a new cough suppressant, sold in American pharmacies under a proud brand name. Heroin. They marketed it as a safe, non-addictive substitute for morphine. It was recommended for coughs, colds, and irritable babies. It stayed on the open market for years. By 1900, patent medicine had grown into one of the largest industries in the United States. Americans were spending an estimated $75 million a year on these products. At a time when a working man earned about $1 a day, the medicine men were among the richest people in the country. They built mansions, bought newspapers, and funded senators, and they had one golden rule. Never, ever tell anyone what's in the bottle. The formula was the secret. The secret was the business. And the business was protected by the most powerful advertising machine the country had ever seen. Here's a detail almost nobody knows. Patent medicine companies were the single biggest advertisers in American newspapers. In some small papers, their ads made up half of all revenue. And buried inside those advertising contracts was a quiet little clause written in red ink that would come to be known as the Red Clause. It said the contract would be automatically canceled if the state ever passed a law restricting patent medicines. Think about what that means. Every editor in America knew that if his state legislature even debated a medicine regulation bill, his paper's biggest source of income would vanish overnight. So the newspapers didn't just stay silent. They actively killed the story, state after state, year after year. The press was muzzled, the government was bought, the bottles kept selling, and the first people to pay the real price were children. In the autumn of 1901, in St. Louis, Missouri, the city health department was producing diphtheria antitoxin, a genuine life-saving treatment, using serum drawn from a retired milk wagon horse named Jim. Jim contracted tetanus. Nobody caught it. His contaminated serum was bottled and shipped to doctors across the city. 13 children died, not from diphtheria, from the medicine meant to save them. 13 small funerals in one city, in one season, because not one federal rule existed to require testing what went into a vial. Congress responded the following year with the Biologics Control Act, a narrow law covering vaccines and serums. It was the first crack in the wall. But the patent medicine empire, the tonics, the syrups, the secret formulas, remained completely untouched. Attacking it would take something stranger than a law. It would take a man willing to poison people on purpose. His name was Harvey Washington Wiley. Wiley was born in a log farmhouse in Indiana in 1844, the son of a preacher. He'd served as a Union soldier, trained as a physician, studied chemistry in Germany, and by the 1880s he had become chief chemist of the United States Department of Agriculture. A big, loud, stubborn man with a booming voice and an obsession that his colleagues found faintly ridiculous. Wiley wanted to know what Americans were actually eating and drinking. For 20 years, his small bureau of chemistry quietly analyzed the nation's food and medicine. What his chemists found was staggering. Milk preserved with formaldehyde, the same chemical used to embalm corpses. Meat treated with borax. Canned vegetables laced with copper salts for color. Ketchup dosed with salicylic. And medicine bottles filled with opiates, cocaine, and industrial alcohol, all sold without a single word of disclosure. Wiley wrote reports. Congress ignored them. He gave speeches. The industry laughed at him. So in 1902, Harvey Wiley did something no government scientist had ever done. He convinced Congress to give him $5,000 for a study, recruited 12 healthy young men from the civil service, and sat them down at a table in the basement of the agriculture department. Then he began feeding them poison, borax, formaldehyde, salicylic acid, sulfuric preservatives, copper sulfate. Measured doses, hidden in ordinary meals, served 3 times a day while doctors tracked their weight, their blood, and their symptoms. The volunteers signed waivers releasing the government from responsibility if the experiment killed them. They ate everything put in front of them. The newspapers, delighted, gave the group a name that stuck, the Poison Squad. Reporters camped outside the dining room. A vaudeville song was written about them. Their unofficial motto spread across the country. Only the brave dare eat the fair. And week by week, the results came in. The young men sickened, headaches, nausea, stomach damage, collapse. One by one, the common preservatives of the American food supply were revealed in a controlled government experiment to be quietly injuring the people who consumed them. For the first time, the question of what's actually in this stopped being a crank's obsession and became front-page national news. But Wiley had data, not power. The patent medicine lobby, organized under the Proprietary Association, still owned the newspapers through the Red Clause and owned enough senators to bury any bill. Between 1879 and 1906, more than 100 pure food and drug bills were introduced in Congress. Every single one of them died. What finally broke the dam wasn't a chemist. It was a pair of writers. In the fall of 1905, a magazine called Collier's Weekly did something no major publication had dared to do. It declared war on its own advertisers. The magazine hired an investigative journalist named Samuel Hopkins Adams and turned him loose on the patent medicine industry. Adams spent months buying the famous remedies, and sending them to chemists. Then, in October 1905, Collier's published the first article in a series that would run 11 parts. The series was called The Great American Fraud. Its opening lines read like an indictment. Gullible America, Adams wrote, will spend this year some $75 million in the purchase of patent medicines. In consideration of this sum, it will swallow huge quantities of alcohol, an appalling amount of opiates and narcotics, and far in excess of all other ingredients, undiluted fraud. Adams did what no newspaper had been willing to do. He printed the names. He printed the lab results. He printed the alcohol percentages next to the temperance endorsements. He tracked down death certificates of children killed by soothing syrups and published those too. The articles detonated across the country. Ministers read them from pulpits. The American Medical Association reprinted them by the hundreds of Ewell. Thousands. For the first time, the mothers of America looked at the friendly bottle on the shelf and asked the forbidden question, what is actually in this? And then, 4 months later, came the second explosion. In February 1906, a young socialist novelist named Upton Sinclair published a book about immigrant workers in the Chicago meatpacking plants. He called it The Jungle. Sinclair had meant it as a story about labor, about crushed men and starvation wages. But what readers fixated on was the meat. Rats ground into sausage, deceased cattle rushed through inspection, spoiled hams treated with chemicals and sold as fresh. Workers who fell into rendering vats and went out into the world, in Sinclair's words, as pure leaf lard. Sales of American meat collapsed almost overnight, at home and in Europe. Sinclair later summed up the whole affair in a single famous sentence. I aimed at the public's heart, and by accident, I hit it in the stomach. One of the millions of stomachs he hit belonged to the President of the United States. Theodore Roosevelt read The Jungle in the White House, and according to legend, could no longer finish his breakfast sausage. Legend aside, what he actually did was send his own investigators, Charles Neal and James Reynolds, into the Chicago packing houses in secret. Their report confirmed nearly everything. Roosevelt now had Wiley's 20 years of chemistry, Adams's published fraud files, Sinclair's national outrage, and his own investigators' report. The Red Claws couldn't muzzle all of it. The Proprietary Association senators couldn't bury all of it. On June 30th, 1906, Theodore Roosevelt signed two laws on the same day: the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act. The law the newspapers simply called Dr. Wiley's Law. For the newspapers simply called Dr. Wiley's Law. For the first time in American history, it became a federal crime to sell adulterated or misbranded food and drugs across state lines. And for the first time, a specific list of dangerous ingredients had to be declared on the label: alcohol, morphine, opium, cocaine, heroin, chloroform, cannabis, chlorohydrate, acetonide. Notice something about that law. It didn't ban a single one of those ingredients. You could still sell morphine syrup for babies in 1907. You just had to print the word morphine on the bottle. That was the entire revolution. A word on a label. And yet it worked faster than anyone expected. Because it turned out that when American mothers could finally read the word morphine on the baby syrup, they stopped buying the baby syrup. Sales of the great narcotic remedies fell off a cliff. Mrs. Winslow's dropped the morphine from its formula. The market, given honest information for the first time, did the rest. But the medicine men were not finished. They adapted. And what happened next is the part of the story nobody tells. In 1911, the Supreme Court heard the case of a man named Johnson who sold a fake cancer cure by mail. And the court ruled in United States v. Johnson that the new law's ban on false labeling covered only the ingredients, not the medical claims. In other words, you could not lie about what was in the bottle, but you could still lie about what the bottle would do. You could still print cures cancer on a bottle of alcohol and water, and the federal government could not touch you. Congress patched the hole a year later with the Shirley Amendment, but the patch had its own flaw. Prosecutors now had to prove the seller intended to defraud, had to prove what a man believed in his heart about his own snake oil. Convictions became nearly impossible. So the fraud rolled on, decade after decade, under new names and new bottles. Radium water sold as a health tonic in the 1920s, until a wealthy industrialist named Eben Byers drank more than 1,000 bottles and his jawbone came apart. Weight loss drugs, miracle salves. The 1906 law had put a word on the label, but it had never once required anyone to prove a medicine was safe before selling it. It would take one more catastrophe to force that, and this one is the hardest part of the story. In 1937, a respected Tennessee drug company, S.E. Massengill, wanted to sell the new wonder drug sulfanilamide, one of the first real antibiotics, in a sweet liquid form for children. The company's chief chemist, Harold Watkins, needed a solvent to dissolve it. He chose one that worked beautifully and tasted faintly sweet: diethylene glycol, a close chemical cousin of antifreeze. Nobody tested it on so much as a single animal. No law said they had to. The company checked the mixture for appearance, flavor, and fragrance, found it satisfactory, and shipped 240 gallons of raspberry-flavored elixir sulfanilamide to pharmacies across America. Over the following weeks, more than 100 people died. Most of them were children, brought to doctors for sore throats, sent home with medicine, and dead of kidney failure within days. One grieving mother wrote directly to President Roosevelt about her daughter Joan. "We can see her little body tossing to and fro," she wrote, "and hear that little voice screaming with pain. It is my plea that you will take steps to prevent such sales of drugs that will take little lives and leave such suffering behind." Here is the detail that broke Washington. When federal agents raced to pull the elixir from shelves, the only law they could use to seize it was a labeling technicality. The word elixir legally implied the product contained alcohol. It didn't. If Massengill had simply called it a solution, the government would have had no legal authority to act at all, while it killed. The company paid a fine for mislabeling. The chemist, Harold Watkins, took his own life. And in 1938, Congress passed the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, the law that built the modern FDA. For the first time, 32 years after the 1906 Act, a drug maker had to prove a product was safe before it could be sold, not after the funerals. Before, one more piece was still missing, and it took one more near catastrophe to add it. In the early 1960s, a stubborn FDA reviewer named Frances Kelsey refused, month after month, to approve a popular European sedative for the American market because the safety data didn't satisfy her. The drug was thalidomide. In Europe, it left more than 10,000 babies born with severe deformities. In America, because one scientist held the line, there were only a handful of cases. In 1962, Congress added the final requirement. Drug makers now had to prove their medicine actually worked. Safe, proven, and honestly labeled. It took American medicine 186 years, from independence to 1962, to arrive at those three words. So now, come back to your own medicine cabinet. Open it. Every line of fine print in there is a tombstone. The ingredient list exists because of morphine syrup and 13 children in St. Louis. The safety testing exists because of raspberry-flavored antifreeze and a mother's letter about her daughter Joan. The efficacy requirement exists because of Frances Kelsey and thalidomide. The label you never read is a document written across a century of suffrage, funerals, one clause at a time. And here's the uncomfortable ending. The old world isn't entirely gone. Walk into any store today and you'll find an aisle of supplements and herbal remedies that, under a law passed in 1994, can be sold without proving to the FDA that they're effective or having their claims verified before sale. The bottles are prettier now. The promises are softer. But the oldest question in American medicine is still worth asking every time you reach for a bottle. What is actually in this? Whether the world before 1906 was an era of freedom or an era of poison depends on what you value. But understanding that it existed, understanding what it cost to leave it, and understanding how thin the paper is between you and its return, that's essential. If this story changed the way you look at the medicine in your own home, make sure to subscribe and drop a like on this video. We go deep on the hidden machinery behind the systems that shape your life, the ones written in fine print that most people never think to read. There's another story coming soon that you will not want to miss. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.